Well, welcome to another edition of Art Brunch. You know what that tagline says. You've heard it a million times, so I won't bother to say it. Again, our two announcements that I've been offering you for the last 2 weeks. We have a closing reception for our current exhibit. It's on Thursday, January 11th from 5 to 7 p.m. here at the Off-Broadway Gallery at Pine Street Church here in Boulder, Colorado. Title of that exhibit is A Weary World Rejoices. So I hope you will make your way down towards the Off-Broadway Gallery on Thursday. Lots of great refreshments will be available, and of course, fantastic conversation as well. Also, want to remind all of you that I will be doing my inquiry meeting for the art pilgrimage trip to Italy in October 2024. That meeting will be a Zoom meeting on January 13th. That's a Saturday at 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. So I'm going to send out a link for that Zoom meeting the week of to everybody. So if you'd like to join, I'd love to have you. All right, let's get started. We are continuing our series on the art of wisdom. We are on to the Roman tradition. Now, the Romans loved all things Greek. They particularly admired Greek art, religion, and philosophy. Now, there were two philosophies that captured the minds of the Roman leadership class, and they competed with one another for adherence. And it is those two schools I want to examine today, Stoicism and Epicureanism. And I'd like to start with Epicureanism since it is the least understood, or perhaps it's better to say it's the most misunderstood of these two philosophies. If you look up the word Epicurean in the dictionary, you will find a definition more or less like this one: fond of or adapted to luxury or indulgence in sensual pleasures, having luxurious tastes or habits, especially in eating and drinking. That definition comes from dictionary.com. Now, this painting you're looking at by Thomas Couture depicts what critics of Epicureanism think of it. If we look at how it originally was taught, however, and practiced in the ancient Roman Empire, we find a very different picture. Something more akin to this painting. Friends gathering together in a tranquil setting, such as a garden, and having lively, meaningful conversation. Let me explain further by introducing you to its founder. Epicureanism is named for the Greek philosopher Epicurus, who lived from 341 to 270 BCE. He was born on the Greek island of Samos and traveled to Athens when he was about 18 years old. He would later establish his philosophical school there. For Epicurus, the goal of human life should be pleasure. This painting by Botticelli is said to have been inspired by Epicurean philosophy. Epicurus defined pleasure primarily as the absence of physical pain and mental emotional disturbance. The absence of physical pain and mental emotional disturbance. He was also a materialist. He believed, listen to this, that all things that exist were a combination of tiny particles called atoms and space. Now, he didn't originate this idea. It actually came from Democritus. But remember, this is the 4th century when this concept of atoms and space making up all that exists was being discussed. If gods existed, according to Epicurus, they were of no consequence to human beings because they would obviously not concern themselves in our lowly affairs. Now, many deists among the founding fathers of the United States believe the same thing about God, that once God had created, then God had no more concern with life. God had set in laws certain things in motion, atoms governed by mathematical principles, and so God was not anymore needed, and so didn't involve himself or herself in human affairs. Epicurus also believed one of the greatest causes of stress and fear in human beings was the fear of death and divine punishment. Such stress and fears also lead us to have irrational desires. That is, we want things that ultimately do not satisfy in order to comfort us in our fears and stress. Getting rid of such fears and irrational desires would leave us free to pursue the experiences that bring life more lasting pleasures, like friendship or a fulfilling vocation. Now, even though Epicurus emphasized the goal of life as happiness and pleasure, he was not a hedonist in our sense of the term. He did not indulge in expensive meals, luxuries, or sexual license. He owned only 2 cloaks. His primary diet was bread and olives, with an occasional treat of a slice of cheese. And he chose friends over romantic entanglements. So really, his application of his philosophy is quite at odds with what his critics said of him. According to Epicurus, we typically make 3 mistakes when thinking about pleasure. First of all, he said, we think we need romantic relationships. But think of all the emotional drama and stress that come with them. So Epicurus preferred to be celibate. We think we need lots of money. But as we all know, once we have enough to meet our basic needs, more money never results in greater happiness, at least long term. And he believed that we put too much faith in luxury. We all know after a month or 2, we grow accustomed to a new luxury and crave something more and different. And this craving never ends. Now, it's quite remarkable that we know as much as we do about Epicurean philosophy, since with the dawn of the Christian Empire in the late 4th century, this philosophy disappeared from public discourse for about 1,000 years. Much of what we know about Epicureanism today came from an amazing discovery of a manuscript recounted in this marvelous book, The Swerve, How the World Became Modern, by Harvard literary historian Steven Greenblatt. It was published in 2011. This book had me hooked the moment I finished the first page. It is such a marvelous book, recounting a wonderful literary adventure. So I'd like to give you a brief summary of it. The book tells the story of how, with the collapse of the Roman Empire in 476 CE, Christianity became the only permitted religion. Most of the literary works of ancient Greeks and Romans were no longer copied or reproduced. Many of these classic manuscripts and codexes that did exist sat molding on the shelves of monastic libraries and were largely forgotten. Such was the fate of works by Epicurus and about his philosophy. In 1417, though, papal secretary Poggio Bracciolini set out on a search for the lost books of the Roman Empire. Poggio scoured Europe and found many long-lost manuscripts. One of them was a beautiful poem by the Epicurean Lucretius, titled On the Nature of Things. Have you heard of it? In that poem, Lucretius lays out the philosophy and application of Epicureanism. These ideas will threaten many of the Renaissance Church's most cherished tenets and remake the Western world, according to Greenblatt. Now, as taught by Epicurus, Lucretius believes that the universe is made up of tiny particles invisible to the eye called atoms. These atoms collide with one another to create all of the things of the world. Even our souls are made up of these particles. And so when we die, they simply are released to collide with other atoms and become something else. So here's the significant and dangerous implication of these ideas. This philosophy requires no involvement by gods. and therefore people need not fear divine punishment after death. And the soul as we know it also no longer continues. Therefore, during this life we have, we should seek happiness and pleasure. Living simply and being kind are important to such a way of life. Though religions, including the paganism of Rome, are understandably worried about such ideas, the philosophy becomes popular, especially among the wealthy of the Roman Empire. It also captures the minds later on of Renaissance thinkers, and according to Greenblatt, lays the intellectual foundation for the Enlightenment and modern science. This first-century fresco shows the mythical human sacrifice of Iphigenia, daughter of Agamemnon. Lucretius cited this myth in his poem as an example of the evils of popular religion, which requires sacrifice, including the sacrifice of happiness to appease the gods. Such ideas will face resistance in Renaissance Europe. Friar Savonarola of Florence condemns Epicureanism and collects objects of frivolous pleasure, which he burns ceremoniously in a public square. This event came to be known as the bonfire of the vanities. Despite the church's efforts, Lucretius's ideas escape their confines and begin to change the outlook of more and more leaders in the arts and sciences. William Shakespeare writes play passages influenced by On the Nature of Things. And Galileo risks his life to uphold the Epicurean belief that the earth is but one of many planets. And my dear Thomas Jefferson, a devotee of Epicureanism, includes in his Declaration of Independence that people have a right to the pursuit of happiness, a very Epicurean idea. Late in life, Jefferson confessed his devotion to Epicurus in a letter to a friend. He says, "As you say of yourself, I too am an Epicurean. I consider the genuine, not the imputed, doctrines of Epicurus as containing everything rational in moral philosophy, which Greece and Rome have left us." Now, about Greenblatt's strange book title, The Swerve. Epicurus believed that atoms moving through the void are subject to a slight, unpredictable swerve. Greenblatt uses the concept to describe the history of Lucretius's poem. He says, the reappearance of his poem was such a swerve, an unforeseen deviation from the direct trajectory, in this case toward oblivion, on which that poem and its philosophy seem to be traveling. The recovery of the ancient text is seen as its rebirth. Greenblatt's claim is that it was a key moment in a larger story of how the world swerved in a new direction toward modernity, towards the Enlightenment. Epicureanism, which teaches the mortality of the soul, the lack of a need to worship the gods, and places the pursuit of pleasure as its highest virtue, obviously and understandably has faced harsh criticism from Roman times on into the Renaissance and even today. In his Inferno in the Sixth Circle of Hell, Dante Alighieri meets Farinata, an Epicurean from Florence. As shown here in an illustration by Gustave Doré, Epicurus and his followers are imprisoned in flaming coffins for the heretical belief that the soul dies with the body. So let's summarize the main applications of Epicureanism. Avoid societal obligations. Why? Because involvement in politics and even civic organizations produce unsettling conflict and stress. It unquiets the mind. and reduces the chance for pleasure and happiness. Instead, focus on friendships, because unlike romantic alliances, friends more often focus on our good qualities and tend to support us unconditionally. We should pursue pleasure then over virtue. Virtue is important, but only as it serves to eliminate pain and discomfort in our life. And finally, the gods are uninvolved in our life, so we need not fear divine retribution. We shouldn't concern ourselves with the afterlife. Don't worry, be happy. Well, Epicureanism's great rival for the hearts and minds of the Roman elite was Stoicism. Its three best-known thinkers were Zeno of Citium, who founded the philosophy around 300 BCE, Epictetus, a slave, and Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor. Quite a diverse group of people. And by the way, Zeno was once very wealthy, but lost everything in a shipwreck. And in reflecting on the impact of that great loss, he came up with Stoicism, the philosophy. Now, Stoicism has a modern usage as well that really doesn't do justice to the ideas behind it. The modern definition of a Stoic is a person who can endure pain or hardship without showing their feelings or complaining. Now, this is somewhat true, but it falls well short of the full definition. Now, take a look at this painting. Obviously, one of the persons in this painting is not acting stoically. And I'll give you a hint, it's not the dead Seneca either. Definitions which offer a fuller picture of the ancient philosophy are best seen in some of its more memorable quotes, like these. Choose not to be harmed, and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed, and you haven't been, said Marcus Aurelius. Think of the life you have lived until now as over, and as a dead man, see what's left as a bonus and live it according to nature. Love the hand that fate deals you and play it as your own. For what could be more fitting? This idea was taken up later by Friedrich Nietzsche. He called it amor fati, love of fate. Seneca said, we are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more in imagination than in reality. And Seneca said, how does it help to make troubles heavier by bemoaning them? Do you agree with these quotes? Their idea? In other words, Stoicism is primarily a philosophy devoted to accepting life as it is and acting only within the sphere of our control. Whatever we cannot control is not worth an ounce of worry. Now, that sounds like common sense, but of course, it's not easy in common practice. The Stoics believed we should pursue virtue, even if it does not bring us pleasure. There's a difference between the Stoics and the Epicureans. For Stoics, there were four main virtues. One was wisdom. Epictetus said of it, the chief task in life is simply this: to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control. Where then do I look for good and evil? Not to uncontrollable externals, but within myself, to the choices that are my own. So for Stoics, wisdom is the ability to distinguish between a good course of action or mode of thinking and a bad one. The wise person uses sound judgment and logic over passion or impulse. We learn about the right way of acting and thinking by reading philosophy and then implementing that philosophy into our life. Another virtue of the Stoics is courage. Epictetus said, "Don't you know life is like a military campaign? One must serve on watch, another in reconnaissance, another on the front line. So it is for us. Each person's life is a kind of battle, and a long and varied one too. You must keep watch like a soldier and do everything commanded. You have been stationed in a key post, not some lowly place, and not for a short time, but for a life." Courage is often thought of as a heroic action performed in a particular moment of time, and the example given here is of a soldier in battle. But the Stoics emphasize ordinary, everyday courage more. For example, the courage to persist in improving your life, despite the many distractions available to us, or the negative influences of peers. A third virtue is temperance. Marcus Aurelius wrote of it, "If you seek tranquility, do less." Or more accurately, do what's essential, what the logos of a social being requires, and in the requisite way. Which brings a double satisfaction: to do less better. Because most of what we say and do is not essential. If you can eliminate it, you'll have more time and more tranquility. Ask yourself at every moment, is this necessary? So for the Stoic, temperance applies more broadly than simply not overindulging in food or drink or Netflix. Temperance for the Stoics meant resisting desire for those things which ultimately do not satisfy and staying in control of our emotions. In other words, we should strive for moderation and balance as opposed to extremes in anything, whether it's a behavior or a thought pattern or an ideology in particular. And the fourth virtue of Stoics is justice. Marcus Aurelius said of it, "And a commitment to justice in your own acts," which means thought and action resulting in the common good, what you were born to do. All philosophies of classical Rome put an emphasis on justice. That's one reason many Roman emperors held a disdain for philosophers. To them, might made right. That was their governing philosophy. But the Stoic sense of justice relates primarily not just to criminal justice, but actually to people's character. We should all possess a strong inner moral code and act for the greater good of the community, even if it means some form of sacrifice on our part. Now, by comparison, Epicurus says that all of the virtues are ultimately forms of pleasure seeking, and that doing good ultimately makes us feel good, even if it means sacrificing something. So, to Epicurus, virtue is a calculation of what is in our best interest. The Stoics disagreed, arguing that doing the right thing sometimes brings no immediate pleasure, though in the long run, it will make us still happier. Now, in this light, some have argued that in theory, the two philosophies differ, but in actual practice, there isn't much difference. Well, let's compare them further. Epicureans believed that the study of science and philosophy would make us more virtuous and less anxious because knowledge of the natural sciences offers a mechanistic explanation of natural phenomena as opposed to the whims of gods. And therefore, we don't need to fear the gods. Philosophy teaches us to accept fate, and it trains us to no longer fear death. In contrast, Stoics believed the gods were more involved in our lives, and therefore required some form of reverence. Worship to Stoics was healthy for the soul. They also acknowledged the possibility of life after death. In this way, Stoicism left a place for religious views and therefore was viewed as less threatening by governmental leaders and the church. So, just like one can be a Christian Buddhist, one can also be a Christian Stoic, or whatever religion or philosophy you want to put in front of Stoic. It's important to point out that Stoicism is not simply a system of beliefs, but a way of life. It's a practice, like yoga or meditation. We have to train our mind through reciting regular affirmations and engaging in contemplative practices. Epictetus said, "That's why the philosophers warn us not to be satisfied with mere learning, but to add practice and then training. For as time passes, we forget what we learned and end up doing the opposite, and hold opinions the opposite of what we should." Because of its emphasis on taking personal responsibility for one's response to the world, Stoicism has become quite popular today in the personal development arena. And perhaps its most popular champion is the writer Ryan Holiday. Have you heard of him? His many bestsellers are inspired by Stoic philosophy. He runs a popular blog and website called The Daily Stoic, and I've put up the website address right there for you in case you want to check it out. One of the Stoic teachings that Holiday emphasizes is to see obstacles as opportunities. See obstacles as opportunities. We can't control what happens to us, but we can control the understanding we have of obstacles. Marcus Aurelius said, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Let me read that again. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. According to Ryan Holiday, we could turn an obstacle into an opportunity if we simply ask the right questions. Well, now let us compare these philosophies side by side. Epicureanism says that we should avoid societal obligations. Stoicism says we should engage in societal obligations. Our virtue requires us to do so. Epicureanism says that we should focus on friendships. Stoicism says friendships are great, but if necessary for the sake of the betterment of society, we should go it alone. Epicureanism values pleasure over virtue, whereas Stoicism values virtue over pleasure. And for Epicureanism, gods are uninvolved in our life. Therefore, we should not fear them or worry about them. Stoicism says gods deserve our reverence. It is healthy for our soul to worship. Which one of these philosophies appeals to you the most? There is an exciting prospect for learning more about classical Roman philosophy, and in particular, Epicureanism. You recall Mount Vesuvius erupting in 79 CE and preserving, in the process, the town of Pompeii. Well, it also covered the town of Herculaneum, and thus preserved the library of a prominent Epicurean resident of Herculaneum, Philodemus of Gadara. His villa was first discovered between 1750 and 1765. hundreds of charred but intact scrolls were discovered. Now, at the time, no one tried to unravel them for fear of destroying the contents. But now, groundbreaking technology is allowing some to be deciphered, translated, and published by scholars. What valuable long-lost wisdom might they contain? This is fascinating to me. So these two philosophies, both popular in ancient Rome and experiencing a revival today, which do you feel could have the most positive impact on our culture and public discourse? I think this quote from the most famous Stoic is most in line with my own understanding of the way of wisdom, and so I'll close with it. If anyone can refute me, Marcus Aurelius said, show me I'm making a mistake or looking at things from the wrong perspective, I'll gladly change. It's the truth I'm after, and the truth never harmed anyone. So I ask you, what truth do you find in Epicureanism and or Stoicism? And which would have the most positive impact on our culture and public discourse? With that, I'll open it up for our Q&A session.